January 3rd, 1192. The date you need to remember. The date everything should have ended. 12 miles. That's all that stood between Richard the Lionheart and Jerusalem. 12 miles of dusty road. 12 miles between the greatest warrior king in Christendom and the holiest city on earth. 12 miles between total victory and complete humiliation. The Crusaders could see it. Some swore they saw the walls glinting in the winter sun. 12 miles. A day's march. Maybe less. And they turned around. No battle. No Sieger. No clash of swords or thunder of catapults. They just left. How does that happen? How does the most powerful Christian army ever assembled in the Holy Land get within spitting distance of their ultimate goal and walk away? How does a force led by Richard, the man who'd carved through Saladin's armies at Arsuf, who'd slaughtered thousands at Acre, who'd never lost a major engagement, how does he retreat? What did Saladin do to him? Here's what makes this impossible. Saladin's main field army wasn't even there. Winter had scattered his forces. His troops were dispersed across the region. On paper, this was Richard's moment. This was the window. This was when you strike. But Richard withdrew. And then here's the part that defies belief. He tried again 6 months later. July 1192. Got close again. Mounted up. Prepared for the final push. And retreated. Again. Without a single fight. You're watching this video because you want to know how Saladin pulled off the impossible. How he won without winning. How he defended Jerusalem without defending it. How he made one of history's greatest military minds talk himself into defeat. This isn't a story about a battle. It's a story about a mind game so perfect, so devastating, that it ended the Third Crusade without spilling a drop of blood. Stay with me, because what Saladin did was darker, more brilliant, and more terrifying than any cavalry charge or siege engine. He turned Jerusalem itself into a weapon. Winter, 1191. Richard's army was exhausted but electric with anticipation. They'd spent months rebuilding Crusader fortifications along the coast, Jaffa, Ascalon, Caesarea, creating a supply corridor from the sea to the interior. Every fortress secured was another step toward Jerusalem, and Saladin knew it. While Richard built, Saladin watched. While the Crusaders celebrated each small victory, Saladin was doing something else entirely, something you couldn't see on a map. He was building a trap, not with walls, not with soldiers, with something far more insidious: fear. By early January 1192, Richard decided the moment had come. His army marched inland. The goal, Beit Nuba, a fortified position just 12 miles from Jerusalem. Take Beit Nuba, use it as a staging ground, then make the final push to the Holy City. January 3rd, they took Beit Nuba. The Crusaders went wild. 12 miles. 12 miles. Some knights wept, some prayed. Victory hymns echoed through the camp. Jerusalem, the city they'd crossed continents to reach, the city they'd suffered and bled and died for, was right there. Wow. Final. Push. Richard called his war council. The plan was simple: rest, resupply, then assault Jerusalem with everything they had. Overwhelming force, shock and awe. The city would fall within days, maybe hours. But then, the reports started coming in. Scouts returned with questions. Enemy movement spotted on the ridges. Then nothing. Supply wagons ambushed on the coast road. Then the attackers vanished. Foraging parties sent out for provisions, some came back empty-handed. Some didn't come back at all. And the weather, God, the weather. Winter rains turned roads into rivers of mud. Tents collapsed under the weight of water. Armor rusted. Food spoiled. Horses went lame. The cold seeped into everything, into everyone. Still, this was Richard the Lionheart. He'd faced worse. He'd overcome impossible odds before. But something was wrong. The knights felt it first, that creeping sensation. Like being watched, like standing on the edge of something dark and bottomless. Days passed at Beit Nuba, then a week. The initial euphoria curdled into unease. Jerusalem was right there. Why weren't they moving? Because Richard was starting to see what Saladin wanted him to see: a nightmare. January 8th, 1192. 5 days after taking Beit Nuba. 5 days of sitting 12 miles from Jerusalem. 5 days of watching the dream turn into doubt. Richard ordered the retreat. The army couldn't believe it. Some knights refused to move. They'd come so far, suffered so much. And now, with Jerusalem within reach, they were turning back? But Richard had no choice, because Saladin had done something unbelievable. He'd made victory look like suicide. Let me show you how. The map trap. Think about what a siege requires. Not just courage, not just swords and catapults. You need 3 things: food, water, and safe roads. Saladin took them all away without firing an arrow. Here's how the trap worked. Richard's supply lines stretched from the coast from Jaffa, from Acre all the way inland to Beit Nuba. Every wagon of grain, every barrel of water, every replacement sword had to travel that road. 12 miles from Beit Nuba to Jerusalem might seem short, but you're not just crossing 12 miles. You're holding 12 miles while also maintaining 40 miles of road behind you back to the sea. And Saladin made sure Richard understood what holding that road would cost. Raiding parties. Constantly. Hitting supply convoys. Disappearing before reinforcements arrived. Not enough to destroy the army, just enough to bleed it. A wagon here. A foraging party there. Death by 1,000 cuts. But that was just the opening move. The real genius? Saladin made Richard see the future. Imagine you're Richard. You're sitting in your tent at Beit Nuba. Your advisors are arguing. The Templars want to push forward. The local barons, the ones who actually live here, who know this land, are shaking their heads. They're saying, if we besiege Jerusalem, what happens? We dig in around the walls. We start the siege. It'll take days, maybe weeks. Jerusalem's fortifications are strong. Saladin rebuilt them after he took the city. We'll need time. And while we're sitting there, hammering at those walls, what's Saladin doing? He's bringing his army back. See, winter scattered Saladin's forces, yes, but winter doesn't last forever. Spring was coming. Campaigning season was coming. And when it arrived, Saladin's full army, the army Richard had barely defeated at Arsuf, would return. And where would they find Richard? Pinned, trapped between Jerusalem's garrison and Saladin's relief force. Caught in a vise. No room to maneuver. Supply lines stretched impossibly thin. An army that couldn't retreat without abandoning the siege, couldn't advance because they were already at the walls, couldn't even hold position because food and water would run out. That's the map trap. Saladin didn't need to beat Richard in battle. He just needed Richard to imagine what that battle would look like, to see himself surrounded, starving, dying not in glorious combat, but in a slow, grinding collapse. Richard could see it. His commanders could see it. And worst of all, they couldn't prove it, wouldn't happen. But Saladin wasn't done, because fear of the future wasn't enough. He needed to poison the present too. The invisible army. Here's where it gets truly diabolical. Saladin's forces were scattered, yes, but Richard didn't know where, didn't know how scattered, didn't know if the reports of enemy movements were 50 horsemen or 5,000. And Saladin made sure Richard stayed confused. False alarms became a weapon. A crusader foraging party would be out gathering supplies when suddenly horns, shouting, "The Sultan's army is coming!" Panic. They'd drop everything and run, race back to camp, sound the general alarm. And then, nothing. No army, no attack, just ghosts and rumors. This happened again and again. Contemporary sources record Frankish groups abandoning their positions, fleeing at the mere sound of an alarm, only to discover later it was false. But by then, the damage was done. The supplies were left behind. The confidence was shattered. Do that enough times and what happens? Your enemy stops trusting their own eyes. They become paralyzed. Every shadow looks like a soldier. Every distant dust cloud looks like cavalry. You're fighting an enemy you can't see, can't predict, can't pin down. Richard's scouts would report movement on the ridges. Saladin's banners spotted to the east, then to the south. Then wait, where did they go? Were they real? Was it a feint? Was Saladin's full army hiding just beyond the next hill, waiting for Richard to commit to the siege so he could spring the trap? Richard didn't. No. And that uncertainty was a poison that spread through the entire Crusader camp. Knights started arguing. The Templars insisted they push forward. The Hospitallers urged caution. The local barons, the ones who'd lived in Outremer for generations, warned that this felt wrong, that Saladin was playing a deeper game. And Richard, the great warrior, the man who'd never backed down from a fight, had to make an impossible choice. January 8, 1192. Dawn. Richard gave the order, "Pack up, we're leaving." The Crusader army turned its back on Jerusalem and marched toward the coast. Some knights wept openly, others cursed. A few refused to believe it was happening. They'd been so close, 12 miles. 12 miserable miles. But Richard understood what Saladin had done. He'd seen the trap, the map trap, the ghost army, the impossible math of a siege that would leave them surrounded and starving. Saladin had won without winning. But here's the thing about Richard the Lionheart: he didn't give up. He spent the next 6 months preparing, rebuilding, reinforcing coastal positions, gathering supplies, waiting for the right moment, the next window, the next chance. And in July 1192, he tried again. This time would be different. This time he was ready. This time he'd learned from his mistakes. This time Saladin was ready too. Summer 1192. The heat was crushing. The winter rains that had plagued the first attempt were gone, replaced by relentless sun that turned armor into ovens and throats into dust. But Richard's army was stronger now, more organized, better supplied. They'd spent months planning this second push. Every detail accounted for, every contingency mapped out. The Crusaders advanced inland again, slowly, carefully. This time they weren't rushing. This time they were doing it right. And once again, they got close. Once again, Jerusalem loomed on the horizon. Once again, Saladin had a surprise waiting. Friday evening, July 3rd, 1192. The Crusader camp was tense. Tomorrow, maybe the day after, they'd begin the final approach. This was it, the moment they'd been building toward for months. Knights checked their weapons, squires prepared armor, priests led prayers. The energy was different from Januaryless wild celebration, more grim determination. They knew what they were up against now. And then the scouts came back, with a report that changed everything. The water is poisoned. 3 words. That's all it took. The water sources around Jerusalem, the wells, the springs, the cisterns they'd need to sustain a siege were compromised, poisoned, contaminated, unusable. Or were they? Nobody knew for certain. Some scouts swore it was true. Others weren't sure. Local informants whispered warnings. But was it real intelligence or planted rumor? Was Saladin actually poisoning the wells, or just making the Crusaders think he was? It didn't matter, because the fear was enough. The weapon you can't see. Think about what poison does to an army. You can't fight it. You can't block it with a shield. You can't charge at it with a lance. It's invisible. Still. And absolutely lethal. A soldier can face death in battle. That's honorable, expected, even glorious. But dying from poisoned water, writhing in agony while your insides dissolve, watching your brothers in arms vomit blood, that's not war, that's horror, and Saladin knew it. Whether he actually poisoned the wells or just made sure rumors of poison spread through the Crusader camp, the effect was the same. Suddenly, every water source was suspect, every drink was a gamble, every decision had to factor in the possibility that your army might not die fighting for Jerusalem, but die taking a drink 12 miles outside Jerusalem. Richard called another war council. The debate was fierce. The Templars still wanted to push forward. We've come this far. We can't turn back now. But the local leaders, the barons who'd been born in Outremer, who understood how Saladin fought, they were unanimous. This is a trap. The water is compromised. The supply lines are vulnerable. If we besiege Jerusalem now, we'll be caught between the garrison and Saladin's relief force, and we'll be doing it without water. Without water. In July. In the Holy Land. In the desert heat. How long does an army last without water? Days? Hours? Richard could win every battle, could break through every defense, could storm the walls of Jerusalem itself, and still watch his army die of thirst before the city fell. That's the genius of it. Saladin didn't need to defeat Richard in combat. He just needed to make Richard defeat himself. Friday evening, July 3rd. The moment of truth arrived. Saladin received a report from his scouts. The Crusaders had mounted up, fun armate, weapons ready, battle formations assembling. This was it. They were coming. And then, they didn't. The Crusaders mounted their horses, formed their ranks, and then stopped, returned to their tents. Stood down. What happened? Richard had asked for opinions one final time. The vote was overwhelmingly against advancing. Too many unknowns. Too many risks, poisoned water, vulnerable supply lines. The spectre of Saladin's relief army materializing once they were committed to the siege. The same trap as January, different season, same result. Richard could see the future again, could see his army pinned against Jerusalem's walls, throats parched, water supplies exhausted or contaminated, while Saladin's forces closed in from behind, could see the impossible choice, die of thirst or abandon the siege, and he made the only rational decision. He ordered the retreat, again. For the second time in 6 months, the Crusader army turned away from Jerusalem without a fight. For the second time, Saladin had won by making victory look like death. But how did he pull it off? How did Saladin, outnumbered, outmatched in direct combat, facing the greatest warrior of the age, how did he turn Jerusalem into a fortress that couldn't be attacked? The answer is darker than you think. The invisible siege. Saladin didn't defend Jerusalem. He made Jerusalem defend itself. Here's what I mean. A traditional defense looks like this. Enemy approaches, you man the walls, you fight them off, you win or lose based on who's stronger. That's how sieges work. That's how war works. Except Saladin threw out the rulebook. He understood something Richard didn't or couldn't fully grasp until it was too late. In the Holy Land, in that brutal climate, across those unforgiving distances, the land itself was a weapon. Geography was a weapon. Time was a weapon. Fear was a weapon. And Saladin wielded them all like a master. Let me break down the specific tactics that made this impossible victory possible. Tactic 1. Destroy the stepping stones. You can't just march an army to Jerusalem and hope for the best. You need forward positions, staging grounds, places to rest, resupply, fortify. Saladin took them away. While Richard was regrouping after the January retreat, Saladin struck a Dharam-A fortified crusader position on the frontier. He didn't just capture it, he leveled it, razed it to the ground, erased it from the map. Why? Because Dharam was a stepping stone, a place Richard could use to support operations inland. Remove it, and suddenly the Crusaders have fewer options, fewer safe havens. The map shrinks. Every advance becomes riskier. This wasn't about winning a battle. This was about controlling the chessboard, making sure Richard had fewer and fewer places to stand safely. Every fortress Saladin destroyed or denied was another calculation in Richard's mind, another risk factor, another reason to think twice before committing. Saladin was playing the long game while Richard was trying to win the short one. Tactic 2. Make them fight ghosts. Remember the false alarms, the phantom armies, the reports of movement that vanished before reinforcements arrived. That wasn't random. That was strategy. Saladin's scouts and light cavalry kept up constant pressure. Not enough to force a major engagement. Saladin knew Richard could win that fight, but enough to keep the Crusaders on edge. Always watching, always nervous. You can't rest when you think you're about to be attacked. You can't sleep when every sound might be enemy cavalry. You can't make rational decisions when your mind is exhausted from constant vigilance. Death by 1,000 cuts, but the cuts were psychological as much as physical. And here's the brilliance. Saladin didn't need a big army to do this. Small, mobile units, hit and fade, appear here, vanish there. Create the impression of being everywhere at once. Make your enemy fight shadows. Because while they're swinging at shadows, they're not advancing, they're not besieging, they're paralyzed. Tactic 3. Control the narrative. Information is power. And in medieval warfare, information was scarce, unreliable, and easily manipulated. Saladin controlled what Richard knew and, more importantly, what Richard didn't know. Where was Saladin's main army? How many troops did he have? Were they regrouping? Were they already in position? Was that dust cloud on the horizon 50 riders or 5,000? Richard couldn't know. His scouts brought back conflicting reports. Local informants gave contradictory information. Some said Saladin's forces were scattered and weak. Others warned they were massing for a counterattack. Who do you believe? And while Richard was trying to sort truth from lies, Saladin was planting more lies. More rumors. The wells are poisoned. The roads are watched. Ambushes waiting around every bend. Maybe they were true. Maybe they weren't. It didn't matter, because Richard had to plan as if they were true, had to account for worst-case scenarios, had to assume Saladin was always one step ahead. And when you're constantly assuming the worst, when you're fighting an enemy you can't see or predict, when every decision feels like a trap, you stop making decisions. You freeze. You retreat. Tactic 4. Weaponize time and space. Here's the thing about Jerusalem. It's not on the coast, it's inland. That means every supply wagon, every barrel of water, every replacement soldier has to travel through hostile territory to reach the siege. And the longer the siege lasts, the more vulnerable those supply lines become. Saladin understood this better than anyone. He didn't need to break Richard's army. He just needed to make the siege unsustainable. Every day Richard spent outside Jerusalem was a day his supplies dwindled, a day his horses went hungry, a day his men grew more exhausted, a day Saladin had to regroup his scattered forces. Time was on Saladin's side. And Richard knew it. That's why both retreats happened after days of sitting in position, not hours, days, because Richard could see the math, could see supplies running low, could see the window closing, could see Saladin's relief force getting closer with every sunrise. Strike now with uncertain supplies and questionable water, or wait and definitely face Saladin's full army. Neither option was good. That's the trap. Saladin didn't give Richard a choice between victory and defeat. He gave Richard a choice between two different kinds of defeat, and faced with that impossible equation, Richard chose the defeat that let him survive to fight another day. The miracle of it all. Step back and look at what Saladin accomplished. He was outnumbered. His army was scattered. He'd lost major battles to Richard before Arsuf had been a disaster. His forces were exhausted from years of continuous warfare. On paper, he should have lost. Richard should have taken Jerusalem, should have ended the crusade in triumph, should have reclaimed the holy city for Christendom. Instead, Saladin won by not fighting. He won by turning Jerusalem into a mirage, something you could see but never reach, something that looked like victory but promised only death. He won by getting inside Richard's head and making the Lionheart see ghosts. The aftermath. After the second retreat in July 1192, something broke in the Crusader army. Not their weapons, not their formations, their will. They'd come so close. Twice. And twice they'd turned back from the prize they'd crossed continents to claim. The dream of retaking Jerusalem, the entire purpose of the Third Crusade, died on those dusty roads outside Beit Nuba. Richard knew it. His commanders knew it. Even the common soldiers knew it. They weren't going to take Jerusalem. Not this year. Not this campaign. Maybe not ever. And Saladin. He'd achieved the unthinkable. He'd defended the holy city without defending it. He'd won the crusade without winning a climactic battle. He'd broken Richard the Lionheart without breaking his army. September 2nd, 1192. Richard and Saladin signed a treaty. The Treaty of Jaffa. 3 years of peace. The Crusaders kept a coastal strip. Muslim pilgrims and Christian pilgrims could visit each other's holy sites, but Jerusalem stayed in Muslim hands. Richard sailed home, never to return. The Third Crusade launched with such fanfare, such certainty, such righteous fury ended, not with trumpets, but with a whimper, and it all came down to those two retreats. Those 2 moments when the most powerful Christian army in the world stood 12 miles from victory and chose to walk away. What made this impossible? Let's be clear about what Saladin was facing. Richard the Lionheart wasn't just any commander. He was a tactical genius, a warrior without peer, a man who'd won battle after battle through sheer audacity and skill. At Arsuf, Richard had shattered Saladin's army in open combat. At Acre, he'd forced the surrender of an entire city. He was winning the Third Crusade by every conventional measure. And yet Saladin found the one way to beat him, not through strength, through uncertainty, not through superior forces, through superior psychology. Saladin turned the battlefield into a puzzle with no solution. Every move Richard could make led to disaster. Advance and risk being trapped, retreat and lose morale, siege Jerusalem and die of thirst, stay on the coast and never achieve your objective, checkmate without a single piece being taken. The genius of asymmetric warfare. What Saladin pioneered, and this is why his victory seems almost supernatural, was a form of warfare that wouldn't have a name for centuries. Asymmetric warfare, information warfare, psychological operations. He couldn't match Richard's sword for sword, army against army, so he didn't try. Instead, he made Richard fight himself. made the Crusaders debate themselves into paralysis, made victory look like defeat and defeat look like wisdom. The poisoned wells, real or imagined, were more effective than 1,000 soldiers. The phantom armies were more devastating than actual cavalry charges. The destruction of forward positions like Durham did more damage than winning a pitched battle. And all of it, every single tactic, revolved around one core principle: control what your enemy thinks, and you control what your enemy does. Saladin didn't need to beat Richard. He just needed to make Richard beat himself. And it worked, twice. The question that haunts history. Here's what keeps historians arguing. What if Richard had called Saladin's bluff? What if, in January or July, Richard had said, "I don't care about the risks," and pushed forward anyway? What if he'd committed to the siege, poisoned water, and ghost armies be damned? Would he have taken Jerusalem? Maybe. Richard was brilliant enough, bold enough, lucky enough, that he might have pulled it off. But Saladin made sure Richard would never find out. Because the genius of Saladin's strategy was that it made the risks seem greater than the reward. It made caution seem like wisdom and boldness seem like suicide. And when you're commanding thousands of lives, when you're responsible for an entire army's survival, when retreat means you live to fight another day, but advance might mean total annihilation, you choose retreat. Every time. That's the trap Saladin built. Not made of stone or steel, but of doubt and fear and impossible calculations. Why this victory defied belief. Think about what had to go right for Saladin. He needed Richard to get close enough to see Jerusalem, but not close enough to attack. He needed the weather to cooperate in January brutal enough to demoralize, but not so brutal it scattered Richard's army. He needed his own scattered forces to maintain enough presence to seem threatening without actually engaging. He needed rumors of poisoned water to spread at exactly the right moment in July. He needed Richard's war council to fracture, to argue, to second-guess. He needed every single tactical element: the map trap, the ghost army, the supply line harassment, the psychological warfare to work in concert. Any one of those factors failing, and Richard takes Jerusalem. But they didn't fail. Every piece fell into place. Every gamble paid off. Every psychological pressure point hit at exactly the right moment. It shouldn't have worked, but it did. That's what makes this victory unbelievable. Not just that Saladin won, but that he won so completely without ever offering the decisive battle that Richard wanted. He won by rewriting the rules of warfare. He won by making the impossible seem inevitable. He won by turning Jerusalem into a weapon that defeated the enemy before they even reached the walls. The legacy. Saladin's defense of Jerusalem, without defending it, became legendary for a reason. It showed that the greatest victories don't always come from the greatest battles. That sometimes the smartest move is not to fight. That intelligence, patience, and psychological warfare can overcome even the most fearsome opponent. Richard went home a legend. Saladin became a myth. And Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands for another century. All because one brilliant commander understood that the most powerful weapon isn't the sword. It's the doubt you plant in your enemy's mind, the fear you cultivate, the trap you build that lets your enemy defeat themselves. Saladin didn't beat Richard the Lionheart at Beit Nuba in 1192. He made Richard beat himself, twice, without spilling a drop of blood. That's not just victory, that's genius.